In our last video, we looked a little bit at the history of sports card grading in the sports card hobby. In this video, we aim to give some points for you to consider if you're thinking about getting some of your cards graded. With that being said, let's get into this. Let's do this in a kind of FAQ style, discuss questions that seem to pop up again and again in different spaces. Question number 1, should I get this card graded? When determining whether or not to get a card graded, the first thing to consider is what is your goal with that card. If you plan to keep that card for your own personal collection, then really whether or not to get a card graded is entirely up to your personal preference. Nobody can give you advice if that is your goal. It's all about what you want and like and whether you feel it's worth the cost. If, however, you're looking to make some money from selling your card, there are some points to consider. For example, A, how sought is that card? Really? When card grading services were really inexpensive for a period of time, many people sent in really low-end cards to get graded. And now if you want to find a, say, Rui Hachimura PSA 10 base optic rookie, they're everywhere. But that card is not particularly sought. As such, a PSA 10 version of that card is still not particularly sought. They are everywhere and they are cheap, like cheaper than the cost of getting the slab, even though the slab was cheap at the time. People are buying the card, not the slab, as they should be. And if the card is not really that sought, who's going to want to pay extra for a graded version of it? So the first thing you want to determine is whether or not that card you are considering is actually a sought card that has interested buyers out there in the wild. When you are making this determination, you also have to have some forward thinking. A card might be very sought right now, but will it still be very sought if it takes a month or a year or whatever the wait time is at the moment to get that card back from the grader? A hot new product on the market right now is not necessarily still a hot new product on the market by the time the card gets back to you. So with this, you kind of just have to use your best judgment. B, what is the condition of that card? And look super closely with a very judgmental eye. But the answer to this question by itself is not enough. More context is needed. A slightly off-centered base card with a dinged corner from 1952 Topps Baseball, or a slightly off-centered base card with a dinged corner from 2021 Prism Basketball is an entirely different scenario. With ultra-modern cards, the print run is so high and the number of cards graded for highly sought cards is so many that I would suggest that card has to be pretty near perfect if you really want the grading process to be of financial benefit, if it is one that has a high print run. If you send a card off to PSA or SGC or CSG or whatever, and it comes back an 8, if it's an ultra-modern card with a high print run, then there's a very good chance that the amount that you could sell it for over the price of raw would not make up for the price of getting it graded in the first place. You might end up actually losing money by getting it graded. Even something graded a 9 won't always really bring you back much of a financial gain, at least with ultra-modern high print run cards. Generally, something that grades like a PSA 10, as long as it is truly a highly sought card, will bring back a solid return. So with ultra-modern cards, you really want to be aiming for that SGC 9.5 or 10, BGS 9.5, PSA 10 kind of score with the cards you're choosing to get graded. If you don't think it has a realistic shot at that 10, maybe see what else you got as possibilities. With vintage, it's an entirely different thing. Even with cards that grade relatively low, if it's a truly sought vintage card, having it graded can definitely help its value. It's difficult to keep a card in great condition over multiple decades, so buyers aren't always expecting a super high grade. But the slab does help protect the card into the future and lets the buyer know that this is an authentic version of that card. With highly sought vintage cards, even if it ends up getting a score of a, say, SGC 4 or 5 or something, there is a good chance that it could still be a financially wise decision to get it graded. In order to determine this though, you really have to do your research about that specific card. It'll be different depending on the card, how sought it is, how common or uncommon it is, and a bunch of other factors. C, the third thing to consider, very important. What is its graded population count? When considering whether or not to grade a card, one important piece of information for you to discover is how many others of that card have been graded already. PSA, CSG, and some other grading companies have those stats available on their websites. The value of sports cards is largely determined by the economic laws of supply and demand. If a card has a super high pop count and a high grade, then it is easier for buyers to find that card. If it's easy to find that card, then you'll have to keep your selling price competitive, which can mean lower than you'd want when you're looking to sell that card. That being said, it doesn't mean there is some cutoff as to how high the pop count is before considering getting it graded or something like that. It's nothing so cut and dry. high. It's just that the pop count is one of those elements for you to put into consideration to add another piece of information into the mix to help you make your decision. If a Zion Williamson Prism base rookie card has 20 or 30 or 40,000 cards already graded, the population of that card in whatever grade it gets is already very high. Is it really worth grading at this point? I would suggest maybe not. But whatever your decision, remember the laws of supply and demand. If that supply is really high, but the demand stays really high too, you might be okay. But if the supply is really high and the demand dips a bit, those prices are going to go down quick. With this in mind, my personal suggestion would be really focus your card grading strategy on cards that are not in high supply. Demand is fickle and can change based on all sorts of factors, but a high supply will pretty much always be a high supply and will affect the value in a negative way over time. Question 2. What grading company should I use to grade my cards? This is another question with answers that are highly subjective and different based on context. First, once again, what is your motivation for getting this card graded? If it's for your PC, the company you choose should be whichever one you like the most. That's entirely up to you. A lot of people I've heard of who choose HGA, for example, are specifically using them for cards for their PC, maybe less so for cards they plan to resell. Not always, but this is pretty common. Or others just simply trust a certain company more as being more accurate, and they may lean that way because of their personal experience with the company, like with CSG, for example. No one can determine your preference for you, but if you're looking to make some money from the cards that you're considering grading, there are some points to consider. A. What is the value of that card? If it's a lower value card, first off, I would say don't grade it, unless it's for your PC. But if you're determined to get it graded, you may want to find the lowest price option available, again, if it's a lower end card. If it's a higher value card, then honestly the best thing to probably look at is the data you can find about that particular card and then compare it to see how much it costs to get it graded from each company. Bear in mind that some companies, PSA for example, upcharge you if a high grade ends up making the cards more valuable. So when you are determining how much each company will cost you, you have to calculate that in. Generally, at least right now, PSA 10s tend to get the highest market price, besides perhaps the ultra rare and extremely unlikely grade that you could get of a BGS Black Label 10 Pristine or an SGC Gold Label 10 Pristine, which are those companies' kind of 10 plus scores. Those ones can very often go for even more than a PSA 10. But you can almost guarantee you won't get that score. But even though PSA 10s sell for the most frequently and are kind of the industry standard for a sought card, you really have to do your research about that particular card and make your decision from there. The answer is not always going to be so cut and dry. Second point to consider, how quickly do you need it back? Look at the current backlog for the companies you're considering. If some have a longer backlog than others, keep that in mind when making your decisions. Sometimes you might not care so much about the delay. Other times, having money tied up in a card you can't sell for a long time into the future until you finally get your card back a year later may prevent you from taking advantage of other good card buying opportunities that may present themselves in the meantime. You kind of have to determine for yourself how important it is for you to get it back quickly, or if that doesn't matter to you, and reflect on where you think the market is headed for that card. If you're looking for a quickish flip, like the season is beginning or the team is in the spotlight for some reason or something like this, a long wait can make you miss that moment when the card may be best ready to do well on the market. The third point to consider, how important are subgrades to you? One frequent knock on PSA is they do not provide subgrades for things like centering, corners, edges, and surface, while the other major card grading companies do. For some, these subgrades help to create more transparency in the grading process and a better understanding for why the card was graded the way it was. If this doesn't matter to you, then there you go. But to many, it's something they value. The fourth point to consider, where do you see the card grading market going in the future? No one can know for sure whether certain kinds of slabs may increase or decrease in value over time. It's likely a pretty safe bet to say that PSA graded slabs are always going to be relevant in the hobby though, since they just eat up a major part of the market share pie, and just so many people have tons invested in them. So they're likely safe. On the other hand, you can also play the speculation game with grading companies just like you would with up-and-coming players. CSG, for example, as was discussed earlier in this video, is very well positioned to become much more significant in the card grading space. And while currently their cards tend to sell for less on the open market than others, I could easily see a situation where those values rise over the next few years to become closer. However, in many ways, this speaks more to the possible opportunity that exists in buying already highly graded CSG slabs on the market than it does to suggest CSG is necessarily the best place to send your raw cards for grading right now. At least that's how I sometimes look at it. But again, just like rookie speculation, approaching it this way is a game full of unknowable things since we can't actually read the future. I really like what CSG is probably going to be like in the future, but I I can't know. E. What company do you want to support? This may seem idealistic to say, but really, wherever we decide to put our money in the hobby is where the hobby continues to grow towards. If you, for example, despise PSA for whatever reason, but you still use PSA, then that disconnect between thought and action is just hypocritical. In this scenario, I'd say either quit your complaining about PSA or use a different company. Question 3. It's all well and good, dude, but what company is best? I can't answer that question for you. Many would knee-jerk react and say PSA. Many others would knee-jerk react and say SGC for vintage, PSA for modern. Others may knee-jerk and say HGA for PC. Others may knee-jerk and say CSG for accuracy. Many others may knee-jerk and say BGS because they somehow traveled back in time to when that was an option. And there's good reason for most of those perspectives. PSA and SGC are both well established and worth respecting in many ways, I'd say. And their value on the open market is clear. They're easy to choose. On the other hand, if you're actually looking for the most accurate grading company because you aren't as concerned about the value, but you're more interested in getting an actually accurate grade, even if it means you may get a bit of a lower number, well, that's a respectable and rare stance to have, so good on you. But it's still impossible to say which company is the best, because the answer to who actually grades the most accurate is really impossible to say. Sometimes it seems to me, at least, that CSG grades are among the hardest and I might even say most accurate, for example. And though the current market on CSG cards isn't really worth that much when compared to others, for me personally, if I see a CSG 10 for sale, I feel more confident that that truly is a pristine card than I would if I saw a PSA 10. But that's not necessarily what the majority of the sports card hobby would say at this point, at least. So that is nothing more than just a personal preference of mine, really. There are a couple of things that bother me about PSA, though not enough for me to really have anything majorly negative to say. But that being said, PSA has a lot of good things going for them too. They are the most likely grading company to forever be around. They currently frequently have the highest resale prices on the market. They're the big dog. Question 4. Do certain companies look more closely at certain things on the cards? By and large, there are 4 categories that all card grading companies are looking at when determining the grade of a card: centering, edges, corners, and surface. And though each of these is important in their own right to the final grade of the card, it seems as if some companies can be a little more strict or lenient in certain areas. For example, PSA is often considered to be slightly more lenient than SGC when it comes to centering and to prioritize corners and edges a bit more. But that being said, I don't think the differences in each company's strict or lenient tendencies is really something that should change your decision one way or the other on where to get that card graded. Whatever tendencies might exist aren't guaranteed to happen with every card, they're just more like generalizations. But there are likely just about as many exceptions to the rule as there are card grades that follow those tendencies. Question 5. Should I send my cards to a group submitter or just send them in myself? This is another question that has some different points to consider. First, how confident are you in your own eye? If you feel that you can look at a card with a close eye to see whether it's centered, whether the edges and corners are nice, and whether there are any micro scratches on the surface, you may be perfectly fine sending in your cards on your own. If you don't feel confident in your abilities to do this, and it is not a skill you have any interest in developing, many of the group submitters that exist out there do offer a service to pre-screen your cards, and if they believe that that card won't grade well, then they will suggest you do not send it in for grading. For some people, this can be a service that is well appreciated. That being said, however, not all group submitters are the same. Some have a track record of accuracy on their pre-screening process, and others don't. So you should definitely do your research about the particular group submitter you're thinking about using, if this is something you are considering. In addition, you will also really want to make sure you are choosing a group submitter that is truly above board and is all paid up with their payments to the grading companies they submit to. The whole fiasco with Marks Cards and others not having the money to pay PSA, the money owed to them, is a testament to the importance of this. So once again, do your research on the specific group submitter you are considering using. Another advantage of using a group submitter is many of them are able to get you a slight discount per card being graded. If you're only submitting 1 or 2 or 5 cards, this discount may not be enough for this to sway your decision one way or the other. But if you are submitting a decent sized stack, that slight discount per card could add up over quite a few cards. In addition, it's not uncommon for group submitters who are submitting cards regularly to be able to get slightly faster turnaround times on the cards that they submit. While I don't think this should be the case, it sometimes often is, and it's another reason to consider a group submitter. On the negative side, however, there are a few things to consider as well. In particular, using a group submitter is just adding one more step in the process of getting that card graded, and each step of the process means more hands touching the card and more possibilities for something happening that could damage that card. And from a skill development standpoint, if you're always relying on someone else to tell you how good your card is, you're not developing the skills to do that yourself. So if you go to a card show and are considering buying this or that card, you won't have created a situation for yourself where you're really able to determine what grade that card would most likely get. That's a very essential skill to have if you're out there buying raw cards that you plan on getting graded. With all that being said, I think that's more than plenty for this video. If you stuck around here to the end of the video, let me know in the comments below. I'm curious who makes it this far. I hope you enjoy the journey. For now, check you later. Peace.